the vice-ridden city of Southfall and the lost cape of Runel, where a god once died and things have been in disarray ever since. Those are two of these darkened places that we're building in our setup series for an upcoming SoloDark campaign, namely a darkened place of civilization, a wilderness, and a dungeon. And so far we have made very significant progress on both the city and the wilderness, but things still remain to be fleshed out and tied together. And of course there's also an entire dungeon missing in our array. So it's time to get back to building. Hello friends, Anderson here. Welcome back to these darkened places where we're still putting the finishing touches on the Cape of Runel, quite a forbidding place full of hostile creatures, of sentient plant people, the Nahemok, the spawn of Runel, or the Rune spawn, I think, as I kind of like to call them as a colloquialism among the mercenary type that are setting up shop here, and of course copious amounts of undead owing to the necromantic style invasion here that ties into one of our terrain features, which is this wizard's tower that hosts the artificial mind device that we presume is somehow linked to preserving the consciousness of our invading evildoer who in the distant past killed a god here whose temple still stands and caused the Cape of Runel to go from a lush verdant place to a fairly barren, blasted land that is filled with the ruins of the past and the fallout of this major world-shattering event. Now, as we continue, I'd like to pick up on something from last time, and that is the resource. I've already put it in a text box in the recent video. I think turning into just having this sap-like god's blood substance here is, to my mind, maybe a little bit too straightforward as far as the resource exploitation interest of Southfall is concerned. I think what we can do is to think it a little bit further, and while this sort of these little maybe amber-like globs that can be very, very rarely found in the Cape of Runel exist, they are possibly not the main attraction of what makes up the main exploitable resource here. So what I'm thinking is that this mere presence of this divine corpse that is maybe constantly leaking this strange sap-like substance affects things. It goes into the soil, it influences the ground, it warps things, it makes plants different, it gives them different properties. So it basically creates through the soil and the associated plant life and possibly wildlife all kinds of strange reagents for alchemical and magical processes, for potions, for magical rituals. So what they're really after in this region, besides the few and far between finds and very coveted finds of pure god's blood, we really need a better name for this, simply kind of mutated plants and animal bones and even just soil samples from specific places, tree branches, not of course any old tree, any old cut, any old soil, but those from places where this presence, this god's blood has doused the soil in a particular way and created a different sort of warped life that exists nowhere else and has special properties. So I'm writing down here mainly plants, warped soil, animal bones, wood, etc. from tainted places, which of course also will every time you start cutting somewhere, you start hunting somewhere, and you extend yourself into those places, summon the Nahemok, the rune spawn, to contend with you and try and stop you from doing this, because they do not tolerate any incursion or any taking of what they feel is theirs. Putting the rune spawn moniker here as well because I really like it. And I think I'm gonna tie in the artificial mind and the hostile sentient creatures, and also take note of this more like necromantic faction opposed to the Nahemok and everyone else. And I think this even gives us some potential for perhaps like tainted Nahemok, which I'm just imagining them driven mad by this necrotic energy and existing in this sort of warped state where they just go berserk and attack everything, including the other rune spawn. So possibly there is a bit of diversity of creatures where you meet the actual sentient Nahemok, you also meet the berserk types driven mad by the tug of war happening here between this necromantic entity and the god spawns Nahemok. And that also creates a nice potential for misunderstanding in the now new coming expeditionary forces from Southfall, who we kind of want to prevent, for the sake of the story, of course, of reaching some kind of accord with the Nahemok, or even trying for it. So having a type of creature out there that also mindlessly attacks everything is kind of useful for that. And of course we take the previous expedition that we also still need to figure out a few things about as an incentive, where we just say the Nahemok don't trust anybody from the outside anymore. They have been betrayed once and they're not gonna let it happen again. Speaking of which, we have the failed colony or forward outpost here. And one of the things I wanted to figure out about this is, was this something that happened that was instigated by Southfall? Or was this perhaps an expedition of another presence, another entity that has tried and failed to get there? And even though maybe Southfall now knows about this, knows that this has happened, it wasn't them originally doing this. I'm kind of leaning towards it, but let's stay true to the spirit of solo role-playing and ask a yes-no question. So we would like to know, with an even chance, I think, whether the original expedition was also affiliated with Southfall. I'm hoping for a no, but I'll take a yes. And I'm getting a no. I'm getting a 4. I would have actually secretly hoped for a 10 and get a little twist into this, but so this was an expedition force affiliated with a third outside party. Now we can think of a number of reasons why this could have happened. Possibly even religious reasons, where some other faction associated with this deity or a partner deity is looking for what actually happened here. But what I find interesting to determine, and I think we have a nice table for this that we can misappropriate, is how long ago was this? So I'm just going to take our how long ago was the most recent darkening table and roll on this to establish whether the recent expedition was like a generation ago, a century ago, or in time out of mind. 4. So a century ago, 100 plus years ago, some other party made their way down into the Cape of Runel, into the blasted lands, and tried to figure out something. And they made it quite a bit farther in than our current outpost. And I think we also need a bit of a reason why this is the case. I'm not too satisfied with leaving it this open and relatively accessible. I do like the idea of having these hills and this like fairly blasted territory where perhaps there's some meager walls still standing from the prior, presumably elven settlements here that were all wiped out and you got these scorched earth places all over the place, but I need some kind of an obstacle. And going with the theme of the Nahemok and their connection to this warping god's sap and this whole history of the place, I think I'm leaning towards turning the majority of this cape into a maze of like thorny, really tree trunk, thick vines that warp themselves out of the ground and form these kind of spiraling walls and hedges, and just this webwork of brambles that are almost impassable and also kind of semi-sentient, semi-guided by the Nahemok, so they are able to grab onto people. They are thorny and they will put themselves in the way, particularly in places where the Nahemok don't want you to go. So this wizard's tower will be covered in them and hidden behind them. There'll be a whole maze to go through before you even get close to that wizard's tower, wherever it is. We assume that we find really thick brambles and vines, and it leads to some kind of nice mental imagery where, like, assuming we have these hill sides here that are making up the majority of our landscape, and then we have a crumbling top of an old tower that is shattered here, lying on the ground, just jagged, maybe a little remnant of a wall standing there, all this old architecture and just these blasted hills, but then out of them and around them we have these like brambles shooting out with these thick thorns and making it incredibly hard to pass through. You have these shifting like vine tunnels that you can occasionally pass through, where it's almost like a hollow between, where the scenery just shifts constantly, and what one day was a viable passage through is the next day completely locked, and you'll have no chance to return to whatever it was that you found. So we surmise that thick semi-sentient brambles bar the way all over the Cape of Runel, constantly shifting, and they are controlled by the Nahemok in some way. Maybe not 100% immediately. They have perhaps some ways to entice them through ritual, through songs, and we can also assume that they are very impervious to fire, that they are very hard to cut down. So the expedition is having a really hard time making progress here because there are all over the place. There are these like also maybe funnel the invading forces into places where they can be very easily ambushed by the Nahemok. One thing I'd like to return to as well is a wizard's tower, because my thought processes last time were a bit geared towards figuring out all these historical events, and I glossed over one small detail, which is how does this wizard have an established tower here if the wizard/lich is an invading entity? And the answer I come up with pretty much now as I think about it is that probably they are a returning invader. So presumably our wizard/lich entity is originally from Runel, but was exiled or left voluntarily. We assume there was some disagreement or contention with the now dead god, and the wizard's return was driven both by power, hunger, and revenge. So this is, if we commit to this now having been an old elven civilization, this is an elven sorcerer type who achieved some semblance of immortality and high degree of power, high enough to raise this undead army and come back and destroy their place of origin, including their former deity, perhaps even in some rebellious notion of this god is controlling me and my people, and just deluding themselves into, I'm actually doing a good thing here, even though objectively this is certainly not the case. But even the most villainous villain does not think of themselves as the bad guy. And this of course also leads to a nice faction dynamic here, where our controlling entity with their undead minions is struggling with the Nahemog and trying to defile their places, while the Nahemog are trying to root out the undead. And now there's a third party in the mix with all the Southfall expeditioneers and mercenaries who are basically just trying to make off with a bunch of goods, and they don't, for now at least, care too much about the dynamics here, although we may end up determining later on that there is some kind of a ShadowDark synergy between the entity that is active in Southfall and the Lich that is active here, and perhaps the ShadowDark is trying to make it so Southfall actually aids this Lich's plans to potentially finish the usurping of the dead god. Perhaps the Lich seeks to possess the dead corpse of the deity and transplant their consciousness into it. That's a thought, and not a nice one. So there is something we can milk here later on to connect the dots a bit into some kind of a more shadow-darkened, overarching regional ploy, where we assume some implicit, even maybe not conscious, alliances between these behind-the-scenes actors that play into the hand of this overarching darkness. Do we need to know anything more about the dead god? I think maybe not really. We can surmise that the dead god and fallen civilization are pretty much lost to history. Their name no longer known. The sole remnant of their presence is the name Runel, but they were assumed to be an elven people, and the elves just call them the Lost, maybe. And that might not even be a term for this specific group only. It's just that whenever like an elven line goes extinct somewhere, the overall connected elven kind considers them a lost line. We can leave some open questions, and one of the main ones is who launched the first expedition 100 plus years ago and why. And I think also interesting would be, how did Southfall end up discovering the special properties of Runel, I'm saying pros ingredients, that ended up leading to their current involvement in the area. So there's got to be some inciting incident recently that led to the rediscovery of this and the conviction that it makes sense to get invested here. That is perhaps something where we assume some kind of behind the scene machinations if we so desire, but I think we leave those questions for later after we've built all the rest of the stuff. Now, leaving our open questions for the future, we conclude our building of this wilderness area for now. And I think before I go further into designing a dungeon, I would like to revisit the city of Southfall and cover two important topics that might help us understand our overall region a little better. One is the religion of the shunned god and how that ties into things. Is it in league with the criminal organization? Is it in league with the disguised monster stalking the city and pulling strings? Or is it doing its own thing? And the disguised monster itself. I'm thinking that even though it doesn't have a direct bearing on our party, I would like to know something about this main ShadowDark agent in Southfall, so we can infer something as well on activities in the region here in Runel and how that possibly links up with our other evil entity here, our Lich consciousness, suspended mind, whatever it is. So back to Worlds Without Number we go, and this time we have religion on our minds. So we look at our portfolio here and we can determine quite a few things. We can determine who the faith's leader is, where the god comes from, why the faith is important, what it wants, and what the priests are like, and what the role in society is. And if we decide that it's an evil religion, we can even decide what the reward of the sinister faith is. And I think it's looking quite likely. So Southfall continues, and we call it the Shun Temple. And we decide first and foremost, where did this god come from? That's a D12 roll. 4. It simply always existed since creation. That's a bit of a puzzler. So it's shunned and it's always existed since creation. Perhaps this is a last remnant of an old pantheon. So we can even think, well, was the dead nature deity also part of it? And now this worship is not tolerated by adherents of the new gods. Putting this in quotation marks as well, because they might not be that new anymore. I'm guessing this is all very ancient history, which covers now most of the world. And this worship continues in secrecy everywhere except for Southfall. I'm thinking maybe these old deities weren't particularly nice, maybe they were particularly demanding, and then the new pantheon comes in and rises up against them. Maybe some kind of a toppling of the old powers that are more like uncaring and demanding and vicious and arrogant and things like that. So we picture maybe a new pantheon that is much more humanized, and the old gods were much more abstract or less looked up to by their people and more feared. Which of course raises the question, why does the faith matter? Which is a die 10. 5. It's the state faith or otherwise legally important. Yeah, we already expected that, but we can also infer here that then other religions have no say at all. Which actually makes me wonder, that puts Southfall in a really weird position with this criminal activity and this weird religion and all kinds of things. So let me go back to our very first overview here. And I think what we can extrapolate from this is that this whole area here, plus maybe this kind of sphere of influence, is the sphere of influence of the free city of Southfall. So I've been wondering about this for a while. How does this fit, and how is this governed, and how does it tie in with other places? And I think with this particular religion and the overall impression that we get from this place is that it simply doesn't, that it stands on its own, and that it preserves its independence by location and its own machinations in the world. But I think since they are sitting right here at this major river, which is probably also a fairly important highway into the backcountry here, we have like a border of an kingdom or empire that's kind of brushing up against it, and it probably has like a major city sitting here. I'm just kind of inferring this from the overall vibe I'm getting from Southfall, and that it is trying to preserve this independence. So I think Southfall has this position where it can shut down the river, it can make it really uncomfortable to mess with it. And so while the power projection of this kingdom or empire sort of theoretically extends all the way to the coast, practically speaking, this is where the influence sphere of Southfall is making its presence felt, and Southfall owes allegiance to nobody, but it is always a player and will often join in like world events, wars and everything, just as a logistic entity, a access giver or preventer, a trade partner, a money lender, all kinds of things. And through this network of debts and alliances over centuries, they preserve their independence. And if ever somebody gets ideas, they will also have the ways to blockade the river and make sure that everybody down the line gets really, really upset with whoever caused Southfall to do this. So I think that's something that I wanted to codify just based on the otherness of Southfall compared to the rest of the world. And this state religion just kind of confirms it. Now, what does the faith want? We roll the die 12. 10. Perform a tremendously expensive rite. So all the money, influence, etc. is just a means to an end. And that's a major world-changing ritual. So they're up to something. Can we figure out, through rolling a die 20, how this integrates into society? I mean, we have an assumption, it's definitely the state religion, but how do the people actually look at this deity? 17, it bestows material wealth upon petitioners. So we have that wealth association again, but at what cost? So is this wealth seeking by its petitioners? If it's granted, maybe also coming at a price that whatever the petitioner then has to do ties into this world-changing ritual somehow. Now let's roll 2 die 20, because now it gets down to the nitty-gritty of what job does this old god still hold. And we'll take a human concern and a natural principle. The red one goes first in the human concern. That is 1 and 6. A human vice and death. Okay, now what? A god of a particular human vice and death that generates wealth to push for some kind of world-changing event or ritual, perhaps to negate or undo this usurpation, or maybe bring back the age of the old deities. So if I think about this petitioning and this wealth exchange, I'm thinking there's like several layers to this, where petitioners can expect wealth from this religion somehow, or at least it relies on it because this religion is wealthy, and then the faithful by association assume their wealth will also fall back on them, and maybe the religion is quite active in spreading wealth into their community, but what the wealth is actually partly coming from is another kind of petitioner, because the death aspect is that it's actually a god of murder. So these murders also generate wealth that goes back into this petitioner wealth cycle. So we have some kinds of petitioners that through one way or another make a case to this religion to have somebody killed, and it costs them dearly, and this is partly what makes the religion strong, and they are owed a lot of favors, and of course they are then also having a fairly hands-on approach to death, which means that the parts of the clergy and some of the faithful serve as some kind of assassins. So the city of Southfall is notorious because it tolerates a murder for hire cult of an old god of murder that was eventually deposed. So we're getting some Baal connotations from the Forgotten Realms meets the faceless men from Game of Thrones, and I'm kind of liking this, to be honest. Question is, what is the human vice that this god is particularly into, and how do we interpret vice here? Is it something more like a sin, or is it something like an activity that's considered a crime elsewhere, like an indulgence, like gambling or drug use, that are perhaps frowned upon outside of the religious practices of this cult? I think we can open this question up, perhaps, if you have an idea what vice fits with this religion. What exactly are we dealing with? Let me know in the comments what you come up with. And finally, the rewards of a sinister faith. That is a 2. The chosen among the believers are granted magical powers or occult gifts. Okay, so we also infer the existence of kind of elite followers receive occult powers and gifts. Whether this means you're a particular high-paying contributor, or you're a particularly successful vicious murderer, or your murders are particularly eye-catching to this deity, remains to be seen. Perhaps a bit of everything, and perhaps remains to be seen wasn't the right choice of words in this context, but I think we have our religion. And I'm rooting around for a way to give a name to our god, and I think I'm going to land on the ultimate toolbox. And we've got a bunch of options here, and I think as far as thematicness goes, names that jump out of me, like those two tables, are pretty nice. So let's roll a die 20, die 6 combination. And for 1 to 3 we go on this table, for 4 to 6 we go here. And what we have is Shiga, goddess of peaceful darkness. I think I rolled that name up once before in Even Night, and I do kind of like that name. Actually, peaceful darkness is, in a twisted way, a really cool name for this one. So Shiga, the peaceful darkness, is the old pantheon remnant, shunned deity everywhere in the world except for Southfall, where it's the dominant murder cult. Probably also helps with the city preserving its independence if you could at any moment end up killed by a fanatical religious assassin somewhere in the world. Which leaves the disguised monster. I think maybe for this we can create our own, or rather a special unique version that we can then read into whatever other monstrous type would fit best, but I want this to be a little bit of an individual, so let's give it a quality first. We're using a ShadowDark monster generation tools. That is a draconic. Okay, so are we dealing with a disguised kind of dragon here? That would be quite classic. Strength 3, a swarm. I'm not sure what to make of it yet. What weakness? 11 fire. Okay, weak to fire. I'm kind of getting like a cluster of swarming insect creatures that take on the shape of a dragon, and that also kind of tracks quite well with fighting it off with some kind of fire theme, also with the ShadowDark thing again, that actually ties in quite well. If I'm just free associating here, I think the draconic, I'm picturing like a sort of a noble ancient dragon that somehow falls under kind of a ShadowDark affliction, where it's struck down by like a sentient evil weapon, and its wound starts festering, slowly killing it and consuming it. And now I'm picturing like a dragon corpse consumed by swarms of malevolent scarabs of some kind that absorb not only its flesh, but also some of its intelligence and consciousness, warping it into an evil thing that can shapeshift, but retains at its core the original dragon shape. I'm basically just getting this from this contradiction seemingly of draconic and swarm, where I'm thinking, okay, maybe it's like a swarm of insects consuming a dragon, and somehow that triggers a development where a new creature with some of that old dragon's consciousness arises, and it's this mass of convulsing, crawling shell bugs that rise up to like an enormous dragon shape, but they can also cluster down into like a humanoid body and use their retention of the dragon's magical ability to just disguise themselves and start influencing the events here. Now, what does it want? What does this disguised swarm dragon want? And I think we're running a little long, so I'll leave this up as a question for everybody who wants to chip in. If you can think of something that an entity like this might want, feel free to pitch in the comments. And beyond that, we will embark on our dungeon generation next time. So thank you very much for watching. I'll catch you then, and bye for now.